Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine... No, it's not. It's nothing to do with Ukraine. Actually, this is just answering a couple of comments that were trying to call me out or calling me out or criticising comments I made about, I guess, billionaires and tax cuts and so on and so forth. A couple of very strong comments saying, essentially, I don't know what I'm talking about. So I just wanted to have a look at these. Even if, I mean, a lot of you might fundamentally disagree with what I'm going to say, but you need to bring the receipts and also just like listen to what I have to say, because it's good to open our minds to maybe the other side of the argument. The first thing to say is I'm going to do a reductio ad absurdum. So in philosophy, that's where you reduce something to a ridiculous level and say, is that a problem or does that work? And if it doesn't work or it's a problem there, then and you don't think it's a problem over here, then it means that somewhere in the middle we've got to have a line, and that can sometimes seem arbitrary, but it's not to say there isn't a problem over here and to deny the problem over here. So, okay, what do I mean here? Well, the reductio would be something like, imagine the richest person in the world had $150 billion, right? It was someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or whoever you want it to be. And you're like, okay, multiply that by 1,000. Like, 1 billion is insanely big. We can't even get our heads around 1 billion. He's got 150 billion. Okay, a lot of it's wrapped up in stocks or wealth or whatever. It might not be liquid cash, but whatever. 1 billion is a huge amount of money, right? He's got 150 billion. Times that by 1,000. Times that by 1 million. Okay, would it be acceptable for one person to have that much money and therefore that much power while many of those people around him or her were in abject poverty? Okay, how would you feel morally about that? That kind of profit is being extracted, if you like, from society, and that's other people paying stuff for your goods that is over and above what they need to pay you because you are receiving huge profits for doing so. So there's lots of areas we could argue where that profit comes from. But essentially, you know, if at some point you've got to say that's not acceptable, unless you just say, well, it's fine for someone to have an infinite amount of money and other people to be in abject poverty. Like, at some point, there's got to be a moral problem with that inequality. And we can talk about things like happiness. We're going to come on to that. But if you admit that there's a bit of an issue with extracting like insane amounts of money out of society, such that one person has phenomenal amounts of money and everyone else doesn't, okay, then we can go, okay, so at some point there's a kind of tipping point where it's like, yeah, that's not cool. I've just said that's not cool at the moment with some of the levels of money that are going around. So it seems like some people are justifying Putin having over 10 super yachts, like as if that's cool, while people in his country, and he's extracted that as a kleptocracy and an oligarchy, he's extracted that from, you know, both his society and the international, I guess, energy markets and whatnot, but someone's paying for that somewhere, and he's you know, getting the benefits of that. So there's no redistribution of that wealth to help people in his own country, for example. And so people are living in abject poverty in many places, and he's got an 11th super yacht at $50 million. You think, okay, is that acceptable? Would I find myself able to do that? No, I couldn't morally live with myself doing that. Now, you can call me some kind of liberal, lefty, or communist or something, whatever you want to attack me with. Like, that's fine, but I'm not cool with that. Like, I wouldn't find that acceptable for me to do. I wouldn't find it acceptable for any of my mates to do that. Right? So, as far as I'm concerned, that's not cool. Anyway, so someone said, and I talked about the Brownback tax cuts in Kansas. I talked about the Trump. So if you don't know, what happened is Kansas as a state did this experiment where Brownback cut was he the governor? He cut the tax rates in Kansas as a kind of as an attempt to get more tax revenue in by trying to stimulate businesses to set up in Kansas and so on and so forth. What's really cool about Kansas is that it allows you, it's like a perfect test bed, because it did this and the states around it didn't do that, and you can compare against the other states how it did financially. You can compare tax receipts compared to what it had before, and there are ways of being able to do kind of fair tests and look at the variables and so on and so forth. And what happened with the Brownback test is it was a complete disaster. So it did tax cuts that benefited the rich, and the public coffers suffered. And Kansas, like the public schools, were not getting money, and so on and so forth. It was a bit of a disaster, and they had to roll back. They repealed. In fact, it was Republican governorship that completely rolled it back, and they said, yeah, it didn't work. Now, what was really interesting about the Brownback tax cut experiments, and you can go and look at you can just Google, were Brownback tax cuts a success? And basically every single article is like, Kansas abandons massive tax cuts that provided model blah blah, the real lessons of Kansas experiment, Brownback's failed tax cut experiment, real life experiment, trickled down economics, Kansas was supposed to be a tax cut paradise, blah 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 blah. You can look at all of these, and it was a disaster. There was kind of one article from a tax foundation, which is a pro low tax thing, saying Kansas tax cuts critique is mistaken, but then it looks at like present day, it's projecting for the next 10 years and said, we're going to make loads of tax now. So it was a success then, because it's like, yeah, you're going to make loads of tax income because of a booming economy, not because of low tax rate. And so it's just, it's not a cool article. But anyway, pretty much all the articles suggest that is a bit of a disaster. You know, you've got comparing Kansas to other similar states. The study authors estimate that the Kansas economy grew about 7.82% less real gross state product, and employment grew 2.55% less than it would have had Brownback not cut the taxes, and so on and so forth. There are lots of you can go and look into the details of Brownback. But what happened with the Brownback tax cut experiment is that was kind of like what the Trump tax cut did in 2017, was it? So there were tax cuts basically for the rich in the US that Trump brought in, the TCJA, and they were a bit of a disaster, right? And that's what I said earlier. I said, look, they didn't bring in tax receipts, etc., etc. And then someone said, Metal Garn here said, sorry, that's a complete and utter lie about tax cuts. Tax revenues went up under the tax cuts. Literally month after month, we saw record levels of tax collection. That is just empirically false. The extreme shortfalls we saw at the close were due to leftists shutting down the entire economy out of irrational fear of COVID. Just not true, because this was Trump in charge from 2016 to 2020. The only time, at least in concept, because it has never worked before, that trickle-up economics could work is if the majority of goods bought were domestically made. Giving trillions to the masses, which we do every single year, just results in a lot of cheap foreign-made goods being bought and quickly thrown away and replaced. I mean, he's smashing loads of stuff together here. Blah, blah, blah. But just this first point about, sorry, that's a complete utter lie about tax cuts. It's just not. It's just, you can read all the stuff you like about the tax cuts, Brookings. I've got the government evidence anyway. You can go and check what I wrote back in response. There's just a huge amount of data to suggest that. Sure, what drove the growth in the first place? The tax cuts. No, what drove the growth after that was the fact that you had COVID and you went into the biggest kind of contraction in living memory. So you're going to bounce back big time. So when you come out of that, you bounce back and you get in loads of tax revenue, and it's nothing to do with tax cuts and whatnot. So thinking those extra revenues were a result of tax cuts, I mean, it's just empirically false. Just all the data suggests that. Anyway, that wasn't so much, because I don't want to get into the details of the Trump tax cuts. But they were problematic, and the jury pretty much is in on that. I mean, there's so much data out there that suggests that they were not cool. The US government own data suggests exactly that. You can pause and read what I took from the US government in terms of that there. But nonetheless, okay. So Brian Ivey then says to me, good God, you know nothing about US tax policy. 15% of the population pays 90% of the taxes. You're simply spouting off the UK Labour Party line. I'm literally not. UK billionaires have a tradition of taking a lifelong vacation. Remember the old saying in London, if Microsoft was a UK company, it would be the largest company in the West End. US billionaires have a tradition of giving back. There is a group of them giving at least 50% of their wealth back. US billionaires have funded startups in new technology that lose money for 10 years of R&D before it's known if they will be viable. This effort contributes to 5% of the entire growth of the US over time. Banks and the government regard these efforts as too risky. Perhaps US billionaires are unique as opposed to other billionaires. 50% of the US population pays no federal tax. We have one of the more progressive tax laws in the world. Any more progressive and the middle class would disappear. I just don't think that's correct. I don't think you do have one of the most progressive tax laws in the world. So when you're looking at all of these things, it's useful to go back to, because we're talking about what you should do. So when you're talking about what you should do in any conversation, you will talk about morality. And politics is just individual morality writ large across society. So it's still morality. Politics is just larger scale morality. So what should you do in government? And normally when you speak to people about what should happen, it devolves down to, or defers down to, essentially happiness. Because usually when you say to someone, why did you do that? Okay, why do you do that? Okay, why do you do that? Generally, it derives to make me happy, or to make them happy, or to make as many people happy as possible in the world. So when you talk to anyone, you say, well, what do you want out of life? Most people will say, as one of their main things, just to be happy. Because even if I don't have much money, it doesn't matter, because I'm happy. And if I have loads of money, well, that only matters if it can help me access happiness. There's no point having loads of money if it makes me miserable, right? So therefore, really, what we want to be doing is saying, right, okay, what kind of situation gives us the most happiness? And you can talk about the US all you like, but the US is quite far down on the World Happiness Index. In fact, I'm going to go and find my last article on that. So the World Happiness Report, I wrote this back in 2022, March, based on the most recent happiness report that came out. World Happiness Report is a really interesting report because it's actually not just how much you smile. It takes into account loads of things. It's a really big document that comes out. The rankings back then, 2019 to 2021, have the US in its 16th position. And you look at many of these countries above the US and you think, okay, what can we glean from these other countries? What do those countries do that we don't do? Because really, if we want to make ourselves as happy as possible, we need to look at the countries that are happiest in the world and say, I want to do that. I want what they're having. Do you know what I mean? But unfortunately, so money breeds greed, and people kind of do other things that are counterproductive to happiness, and that's obviously a bit of a shame. But actually, there's quite a lot of research into tax and happiness. I can show you this conversation article, Why Tax Cuts Make Us Less Happy. That's from 2017. That was on the back of the Trump announcements. The surprising connection between high taxes and happiness, lessons from the world's happiest country. This is from this year. The happiest country in the world has a 50% tax rate. That might sound surprising at first, but it's true. Finland, a country in Northern Europe, has consistently ranked as the world's happiest country in the world, Happiness Report, despite having a relatively high tax rate. Because what happens is, what you're doing is you're paying for the government to provide you services that if you weren't paying those high taxes, you'd have to, you'd be getting paid more and taxed less, but then you'd have to be buying that yourself. Think about healthcare services. So in the US, like, your company has to pay it or you have to pay it, and that's being extracted from society in other ways, right? So even if your company pays it, your company's extracting that, well, that's in their costs, which is then being taken out of society in terms of the cost of their goods sold elsewhere. So it still comes from, everyone's still paying for that healthcare insurance, whether you're paying it by a single payer like coverage in taxes, universal healthcare, or whether you're paying for it by your corporation or you're paying it yourself. And the US has, 20 million uninsured and however many million underinsured people. So healthcare is an interesting one. But in Finland, right, I assume it's got universal healthcare. UK's got universal healthcare. So we get taxed a little bit more maybe, but then we get that with that. So it swings and roundabouts. You moan so often about having a higher tax burden, but it's what you get for that. Now, interestingly, if it comes to healthcare, the US pays $13,000 and something per capita for healthcare. You've got a private healthcare system and you pay $5,000 per head more than the next country. That's absolutely insane. Just beggars belief. The UK, I had someone on my thread today complaining about the NHS crumbling at the moment. Absolutely right, it's crumbling. We pay about $5,000 per head, per capita, for our healthcare system. The US is paying $13,000 and something per capita dollars. And that is over 2.5 times what we're paying. And they've got a private system. So they've got a higher tax burden for their healthcare system, and it's private. So it's got the worst of both worlds, whereas the UK system, we're just not paying enough for it. We need to increase our taxes to pay more into, and in fact, we know from public polling that the UK population is happy to do that, but for some reason, we're just not putting our money where the mouth is. When you look at the Commonwealth Fund, which compares the 12 top countries in terms of, I guess, GDP and what they do with the healthcare, the UK healthcare system used to come out near the top on a load of different metrics, and now comes out the top for like efficiency, which is like doing the most with the least amount of money. We just need to spend more money on our healthcare system. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. When you look at list of countries by total expenditure per capita, you get, so I don't know, I was looking at 2021 figures before. US, 12,190. So 2022, $12,555. The next one down there is 4,000. So it was 5,000 in 2021. So 4,500 now in 2022. But it's just insane. You go back down to where's the UK? Goodness me, we're down in 17th place at 5,493 dollars per capita, and they're 12,555. It's just incredible. So when you look at somewhere like Finland or Sweden, these places, and Norway and Denmark that are high up the list of happiness, what they do is they have a high tax burden that gives the society, one of the things that does is it gives them existential security. So existential security is really interesting because there's a connection between religiosity and existential security. America's an outlier. It's a bit of a weird one because it's kind of messed up in loads of different ways in how it does stuff. So the healthcare is a great example there. But if you lose your job in Finland, right, then you're pretty sure that you'll be all right because the welfare system will pick you up, and then you go and look for another job, and you're not going to sponge off the society because of the way it's kind of structured, and also the people aren't like, we always think, oh, everyone's just really lazy, but actually people do want to go out and work and have a fulfilling life. So what that means is that you're never existentially threatened. So you think, right, I'm oh my goodness, I'm going to lose my job in a month's time, but you're not like, oh, and therefore I lose my house and my healthcare and my this and my that, and Jesus, if I get ill, I could die just because I don't have a job. This kind of stuff doesn't happen in many of these countries, and that gives you a sense of contentment and less worry, and that feeds into your overall well-being and your happiness. And that's worth paying for. Do you know what I mean? Like, if I have to pay some more taxes for that, I'm totally cool with that. Like, Anyway, interesting. World Happiness Report in 2018. Those who pay higher taxes are happier. Don't believe us? Here's the proof. Says, I don't know which news source this is, Financial Express, I think from India. So the happiness report 2018 is out, and what's common between the people of happiest nations is that they pay higher taxes. The top 3 nations in the World Happiness Index are Finland, Norway, and Denmark, and they're among the highest tax-paying nations in the world, with tax rates as high as 60%. The relationship between happiness and tax is not a purely coincidental, but correlated. Eminent social scientist Benjamin Radcliffe has drawn a parallel between happiness and tax rates, saying that high levels of taxation suggest high levels of satisfaction with life and hence more happiness. And it goes down to what that tax burden does for you, right? It's not just, I mean, no one wants to pay more tax just for the hell of it, right? It's not the intrinsic value of paying more tax that is what that pays for. And if you have a decent education system, you have a decent healthcare system, then and et cetera, then that higher tax burden gets you much more, bang for your buck in terms of life in general. So I think that's really important to bear in mind when you're talking about, well, it's great. Look, these guys can have this much money and lower tax rates, and they can go and spend money and invest in this and do all that. You're like, well, whoop-de-doo. So what? My answer to that is, so what? What you want is a functioning enough economy to be able to afford a sensible welfare state. That's how I see life, right? You guys can disagree with me, but let's have that debate. But there's no point making money for the sake of making money. You just make more and more money, and then someone gets richer and richer and richer and richer and richer and richer, and the gap between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger. Actually, what's interesting about those countries that are happiness is they have regulation in place to stop CEOs earning too much above what the average worker earns in their corporations. And that lack of wealth inequality and income inequality feeds into ideas of happiness again. So I think, income inequality in the US, the gap between the rich and everyone else has been growing markedly by every major statistical measure for more than 30 years. So it goes back to this, how much inequality is fine by you? So I'd say, with all due respect to Brian, and Brian's a great commenter and such a great supporter of the channel, but I would say to Brian, how much inequality is fine with you? Like how many billionaires, when that's not spread around and yet it's extracted from, in some sense, those around those billionaires? So how much is good? What is healthy? And again, I would just go back to the only metric I would use to judge that is happiness. So if wealth inequality leads to lower levels of national happiness, then that's a bad thing, and we need to change that. So income inequality, wage inequality, so on and so forth. So income inequality includes streams from wages, salaries, interest on a savings account, dividends from shares of stock, rent, and profits from selling something for more than you paid for it. Unlike wealth statistics, income figures do not include the values of homes, stock, or other possessions. Income inequality refers to the extent of which income is distributed in an uneven manner among the population, and that has been going up with spikes a lot over the years, and the same for wealth inequality as well. Over the past 4 decades, the richest 1% of Americans have enjoyed by far the fastest income growth. The most rapid increase has occurred in the tippy-top of the economic ladder. Between 1979 and 2019, the average income of the richest 0.01% households, a group that today represents about 31,500 people, grew more than 9 times as fast as the income of the bottom 20% of earners. These Congressional Budget Office figures include income from labor and investments. They do not account for taxes and means tested public assistance such as food stamps and Medicaid. And it just, look at that bar graph. Income disparities are now so pronounced that America's richest 1% of households average more than 84 times as much income as the bottom 20% in 2019. Americans in the top 0.01% tower stunningly higher. With average household income of $43 million, they bring in 1,807 times more income than the bottom 20%. And then you get this. So the pay gap between top executives and workers, this is going back to 2019 here, continues to be wide. Since 1978, CEO compensation rose 1,007% for CEOs compared to 12% for average workers, according to the Economic Policy Institute. So again, the question is that cool? Like, is that a benefit to society? And does that make people happier? Is it like, when does that, like, is 2,000% all right? How about 20,000%? So that's the reductio. Do you agree that at some point that becomes unacceptable? And if Brian or anyone else here agrees that at some point that does become unacceptable, all we're doing is arguing over where that line is. So to accuse me of not knowing what I'm talking about or saying I'm wrong or whatever is not to understand quite what I'm saying here. Is to say that for me, that income inequality and that those differences are not acceptable for me, and I find them morally abhorrent when it is not giving extra like happiness value to society. And we can look at other societies where that is managed better and it gives better outcomes for happiness, for well-being. And so that's what I would criticize. Like, if I'm looking at the world happiness charts, right, I would be, if I was the US, no, if I'm the UK, which is one step below that, I would be, I don't want to be in 17th. I want to be in first or second or third, right? I want to be in the medal positions. What do I need to do that? It's not good enough just to say, well, tax cuts make richer people and rich people invest stuff in X, Y, and Z, which, you know, is true. But that also happens that would also happen if you were to divide 1,007% by 2. If you were to half that, people would still be investing and doing R&D. Or you could set up a situation whereby the profits are managed in a slightly different way. So, you know, social responsibility of business includes profit. So the people who criticize profits, there are ways, and this guy's written a book, Grow the Pie, how great companies deliver both purpose and profit. So you can make good profit, but you can also generate social responsibility from that as well. And it's not to say profit is bad and evil and it's like this envy grievance. It's not that at all. It's just like, do you know what? At some point, that's too much. It's just too much when those around you have not. And it's just, I don't want everyone having the same, like that kind of egalitarian idea. I want equality of opportunity. I want people to have the same opportunity to do well in society, knowing that we're not blank slates and people are different and we have different brains and different environments and different experiences. And also we do need people to stack shelves and to clean streets and to run multi-billion-dollar corporations. So it's understanding all that, but just curtailing the excesses. Just like, yeah, I'm not cool with that. I'm cooler with that. I don't want that, but I might not be able to put an exact line as to where that's cool and not cool. Like, that line doesn't exist because it's fuzzy logic. So it's, but there is a difference between here and there. That I can't put a line, and this is a Socrates paradox, that I can't put a line doesn't mean there isn't a difference. I get that billionaires can do good stuff. And in fact, I've written an article on millionaires that do this. So I wrote an article recently in June this year, the millionaires who want to tax the rich. And I wrote an article about a bunch of people in the US called in fact, there's a British version of this as well, called the Patriotic Millionaires. And the quote at the top of their website is, "I'm not more altruistic than the next guy. I'm just greedy for a different kind of country." And these are a bunch of people who say, do you know what? We need to be taxed more, and this is why. And they go on and they go and talk in different cities and towns, and they talk to people, you know, average Joes, and they do these sessions with them and talk about how tax works and actually why it's not in your best interest to vote for people who are going to give tax cuts to the rich. It's really interesting. So, you know, you can talk about, billionaires eventually getting so much money that they give loads of it away. But then you can look at people like Trump who don't do anything like that. They're so selfish, it's not even on their radar. Well, actually, in my article on defending billionaires, I wrote about how Bill Gates sees this. So, after all, Bill Gates' tax rates on the wealthy are nearly double when we started Microsoft, and it didn't hurt us. So that's an article that he was interviewed about. So the tax rates were double, and we were cool. Thank you very much. Indeed, Bill Gates has a net worth of 113 billion at the time of writing, and that's a lot. And he recently says he has a disproportionate amount of wealth. or reward. So, quote from him, "The wealth gap is growing. The distance between top and bottom incomes in the US is much greater than it was 50 years ago. Gates writes, "A few people end up with a great deal. I've been disproportionately rewarded for the work I've done, while many others who work just as hard struggle to get by." It's this idea that luck plays a huge part. Yeah, you can be visionary. Yeah, you can have great ideas, but right place, right time. And suddenly you're a billionaire. But you're actually no more valuable, no greater in your knowledge or skill set than another person, right? And that's really interesting that he admits that himself. It's not me saying that. It's him saying, "I don't deserve this much money. He said before, I've got more money I can spend." BP made such record profits last year. Was it last year? That the treasurer, in a meeting that was kind of leaked, said, "We've got more money than we know what to do with." So when you're going back to here, you're like, I know what you could do with that. You could bring down the single-handedly, BP could have brought down the energy crisis going on in the UK with households not being able to afford to pay their energy bills and having to have a charity set up by the government to help people pay their energy bills. Meanwhile, British Gas, Shell, Texaco, Exxon Mobil were all making record profits. So that's the producers of the hydrocarbons, the distributors of the energy, and everyone's saying, "Oh, we've got this energy crisis where everything's become so expensive that we're having to pass it on to the consumer." Hang on, if it's so expensive, why are all of you making record profits? And why we having record hurt in terms of what we can afford and what things are costing us in our houses, and why we having to be bailed out by a state-run charity, and you guys at exactly the same time, all of you are saying you're making record profits. Something is wrong there. And this goes back to Bill Gates again. He proposes a wide range of ways to make higher taxes on the rich a reality. Many of them ideas he suggested before: raising the capital gains tax, raising the estate tax, removing the cap on income subject to Medicare taxes, closing the carried interest loophole, and mostly lets savvy investors pay less in taxes, and taxing large fortunes. He prefers to tax them once they've been held for a long time, such as 10 years. Yeah, if you're going to sit as I said before, this other guy saying, "Oh, don't pay poor people, that's not the best way to stimulate the economy." It is, because they spank it and it gets spent locally, and you give $1,000 to a rich person, that'll sit in, more often than not, sit somewhere unmoving. It's not going to touch the sides. It won't be a money multiplier, I would argue, at least not to the same degree. Well, this is kind of what Bill Gates is saying here, which is, if someone's sitting on a whole bunch of money for a long time, then you know what, that could be put to much greater use. Morally speaking, it's just a moral obligation to do that, to alleviate the suffering of other people, if that can be done, if it's doing nothing elsewhere. So not other than making an already adequately rich person even richer. None of these are unique ideas, and many of them have been proposed by tax policy experts, which Gates admits he isn't. They're also strikingly similar to proposals that have been raised in the Democratic presidential primary, though Gates writes that he will not take a position on the proposals that are being debated during this campaign season. So this is previously. Deservedly or not, this is not me writing, by the way, this is an article. Gates has a lot of influence in our national conversation about the ultra-rich and what they do, so it's significant to have him among the prominent billionaires pushing for higher taxes and rebutting many of the arguments that such taxes would be unfair on the rich or discourage innovation. So this discourage innovation is a talking point that has, as far as I'm aware, been debunked many times. Taxes, Gates points out, were much higher when he founded Microsoft, which didn't get in the way of his motivation to start the company. Quote, "A dynastic system where you can pass vast wealth along to your children is not good for anyone. The next generation doesn't end up with the same incentive to work hard and contribute to the economy," Gates writes, defending higher estate taxes, what we call inheritance tax. And the difference between capital gains taxes and income taxes favour wealth over work, and with no good justification. That's really interesting. So I wrote an article on this that was a long time ago, Now, I'm going through the weeds here of like stuff that's in my head. I haven't really prepared much of this other than putting some tabs up there. But I wrote this years ago when we had Theresa May as Prime Minister, and she said, and she was kind of going back to what the previous Conservative Prime Minister John Major said, get on your bike, go and get a job, meritocracy. And this idea that we live in a meritocracy, and if you work really hard, and then you will get paid well for that. And she said she had a speech on meritocracy. And I don't want to read you. Well, I will actually, because I think this is so fundamentally flawed and it's relevant to this, and exactly relevant to what Bill Gates has just said. So when I stood in Downing Street as Prime Minister, said Theresa May, for the first time this summer, I set out my mission to build a country that works for everyone. Today, I want to talk a little about what that means and lay out my vision for a truly meritocratic Britain that puts the interests of ordinary working class people first. In other words, if you work really hard, you will merit getting paid, and you go up that ladder and you can, through your own hard endeavour, you can be rewarded by getting a better and better job, etc., etc., etc. And society and success is all about merit. I want Britain to be the world's great meritocracy, a country where everyone has a fair chance to go as far as their talent and their hard work will allow. I want us to be a country where everyone plays at the same rules, where ordinary working class people have more control over their lives and a chance to share fairly in the prosperity of the nation. And I want Britain to be a place where advantage is based on merit, not privilege. It's really important. That line is so important to what I'm just about to say. Where it is your talent and hard work that matter, not where you were born, nor who your parents are, or what your accent sounds like. That paragraph is utterly contradicted by what she said pretty much, I think, in the same speech or on the same day. Let us not underestimate what it will take to create that great meritocracy. It means taking on some big challenges, tackling some vested interests, overcoming barriers that have been constructed over many years. Okay, I think it was at the same time, on the same day, or possibly even at the same kind of speech thing. She then also talked about cutting the inheritance tax threshold. So it's like she literally said, I want a society where we have merits, where you merit the reward that you get. You deserve it because you worked hard at it. And by the way, the Conservative government is proposing cutting inheritance tax thresholds. So in other words, you can earn more and more money, or have more and more money to pass on to your children, and the government won't take a cut of that. And you might think that sounds fair, and I'd love, if my parents are millionaires, I would love to inherit all of that money, right, and not have the government get a hold on it. But what that does is that promotes privilege. It means that you might as well, there's absolutely no merit in that, because I am not the one that worked for my parents' wealth. They don't have great wealth, but imagine they did. They're all right, but imagine you've got a millionaire, right? It works really hard to, or as Bill Gates says, didn't work any harder than anyone else, but is in a position where they've somehow merited that money. Giving it to your children is not something that promotes meritocracy, because your children have done nothing other than being the accident of history and geography to have been born into that family to have got that money. You might as well go down the street with that money and say, you can walk up to two children, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I'm going to give you £1 million. Why? I'm just a random child on the street. Yeah, it's the same as me giving that as an inheritance to my children. In terms of merit, right? Just randomly giving a child that doesn't deserve that money. So you can't do a speech like that on the one hand and then propose, it's actually raising, it's not cutting the inheritance tax threshold, it's raising the threshold so that you can give more money away without it being taxed. Now, what inheritance tax does, or at least it should do in principle, is redistribute the wealth and ring fence it for equality of opportunity policies. So you say, right, you're really rich, you've died, you don't exist anymore, so you don't care, that money's not yours, you're going to give it to your kids, actually you've extracted that from society and blah, 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 we're going to take a portion of that. And what government should do is not just put that into the general coffers, but say that money is going to go towards policies that promote equality of opportunity, so that people who don't get the chance of inheriting a bunch of money and getting a lift up. So, because essentially what inheritance does is it promotes privilege. So you're just privileging some children who don't necessarily deserve it. I mean, you can talk about then taking on the business and then working towards that, and that's a different situation. But just imagine you've got, I don't know, 2 7-year-old kids and you die and you leave them all no money. That's fantastic for those kids. And that's what I would want to do with my kids. And that's what my kids would want from me. And it's what I would want from my parents from a personal, selfish point of view. But if I'm looking from the position of a government arranging a society, I would recognize that that promotes privilege. And allowing that to happen gives certain people an unfair leg up in society. It means that they are getting a huge amount of money with having not merited it. And so I would want to, from a societal, governmental point of view, want to arrange society whereby it was fair, and people and people weren't able to get an unmerited leg up, and that we would try to equalize the opportunity, not equalize the outcome. It's not about equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. Donald Trump inherited $140 million, right? And he's a billionaire now. Well, it turns out if he'd invested that money in, like, just put it in a bank for all that time, he would actually be richer now than he is. He's had 4 bankruptcies and whatever. But nonetheless, there's an example of privilege. $140 million. And he's, look at me, I'm amazing. Yeah, you made all that money because you were given all that money, right? If you are going to tax that wealth, then you need to put that into policies that are going to enable people to move up that social demographic ladder, right? Social mobility. So we need to. You are struggling because of where you were born and who you were born to, and how this all works for you and the mix that you are. So we are going to. We're not just going to give money to poor people. It's about equalizing opportunity for people, so everyone has the same equality of opportunity. Like the people aren't disadvantaged just by point of fact of who they were born to, or how they were born, or where they were born. And this person is born into money, and so therefore they're given a massive leg up that gives them a greater education, that gives them blah blah blah. And it's this kind of virtuous cycle that these guys are privileged to get because of what? Because of the randomness of their birth. Anyway, don't confuse what I'm saying with being somehow anti-capitalistic, or like I am a capitalist. I mean, it's the least worst form of economics, right? But I'm actually a mixed economy kind of person, which is you need sensible government in legislation, and you need a decent state to provide a good welfare system that's somewhere in the middle. Like, somewhere, the social democracies of the Nordic states for me are great. Why are they great? Because they give you the greatest happiness. Like, that's it. That's my metric. So, if you want to disagree with that because you want more people to be richer, you want a smaller portion of people to be crazy rich, then that's great. But what good is that for society? What good is that for the nation? Like, what good is that for the world? And where do you stop that? Where do you draw the line? Like, you might not be able to exactly draw it, but at least understanding that at some point that's obscene money that is unnecessary is all I'm saying. So that's kind of my tuppence. And I'm not having a go at any of these commenters at all. And Brian, I really respect you and really appreciate you. You supported this channel so much. But I am saying that I do understand. He's so far left, he's almost a communist. I'm not at all. But I understand that, just going for low tax cuts because it makes the rich richer, under the guise of it's really good for those further down, that trickle down economics is not work. There's no data to properly support that kind of economic model. And really good. But if you want a nice introductory book on, I'm actually reading an economics book at the moment, but Ha-Joon Chang's book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. I think it's a really good book. That's a nice primer on loads of stuff. In fact, let's go and find that, shall we? Now, it's a little bit old now. It's 11 years old. Probably a lot more to say about that since then. But Ha-Joon Chang's excellent book, really easy to read. I read that years ago, probably in 2012. 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism is a decent primer, but, you know, those on the right would say, oh, it's lefty nonsense or whatever, but it is decent book, gives you some real understanding that actually when people think that free market economics is what's leading to this success here, there, you can look at Singapore, you can look at the Industrial Revolution and think that it's all because of free market economics. Actually, no, the Industrial Revolution was infant industry protectionism and the strategic planning of the Singaporean government in with their SEOs and whatever SEOs are just is not free market capitalism in the way that you think it is, and so it just really gives you a great understanding of some of these ideas. Anyway, it's me rambling on now, but that was, in fact, just a big ramble, an excuse to talk a bit of economics. You may or may not have appreciated that, but just beware of defending billionaires just out off the cuff. The question is, why are you defending these kind of positions, or why are you defending tax cuts? What do you want out of it? Is it about economic stimulus? Well, you need to show me that it's the best way to produce economic stimulus. And economic stimulus for whom? And what does it say about these other metrics of success? And, you know, why? That's enough for me. Take care. Speak soon.